So before I start, I just want to make sure to clear up that when I say ground reaction force, external moment, or torque, these things all mean the same thing. It's just an external rotational force occurring around a joint. So I'll start off with the ankle and hip joints first, because I feel like it kind of makes sense to pair those together. And the rule that I remember for these is that the direction of torque is the opposite of the group of muscles active in that phase. So let's say that in one phase you're in a plantar flexion torque, then that means that the muscles that perform active dorsiflexion, being the tibialis anterior, extensor hallucis longus, and extensor hallucis brevis, are the muscles that are contracting either concentrically or eccentrically, and same thing vice versa. All right, so we'll start off with the ankle right here. And starting on the left with initial contact, you can already see that this kind of rule is already kind of written out. So when your foot makes first contact with the ground, it starts in a plantar flexion torque. And your foot is controlled to the ground and the tibia is advanced forward through an eccentric contraction of the dorsiflexor muscles. And this continues until the tibia advances kind of past neutral, and when this shift happens in mid stance is when it shifts from a plantar flexion moment to a dorsiflexion moment. And with this, the muscular force changes from coming from the dorsiflexors to an eccentric contraction of the plantar flexors. And this continues until in terminal stance, when the heel starts to lift off the ground, the contraction shifts from eccentric to concentric. And then, like to really lift the heel up off the ground, an elastic recoil into plantar flexion happens at pre-swing, which technically there's no real muscle activity then, but it's just a continuation of the same kind of motion. So we just kind of grouped it in there. And then once the foot is all the way up off the ground in initial swing, it shifts back into a plantar flexion torque, which once again, the muscular force shifts to an eccentric contraction of the dorsiflexor muscles, which continues all the way back to initial contact, and this whole thing starts over. So I tried to write this out as simple as possible, and if you can really understand each kind of like loop, both with the torque loop and the muscular force loop, you should be good for all the gait cycle stuff at the ankle. And then at the hip, you should see a lot of similar patterns. So when that foot lands on the ground, it starts out in a hip flexion moment, which is controlled eccentrically by the hip extensor muscles, mostly being the glutes, maybe some hamstring in there as well. And that continues all the way until the later part of mid stance, where you kind of come in to like a neutral degree of hip flexion and extension, where really the only force that's acting on the hip is gravity. And then kind of at this point, it changes from a flexion moment to an extension moment. And you can see that's mirrored in the muscular forces right here. Starting in terminal stance is where the hip flexors begin to act eccentrically, which is mostly controlled by the TFL muscle. And then you go into pre-swing, which is when the thigh begins to advance forward with concentric hip flexion, and that's controlled by the adductor longus muscle. And this is mirrored in initial swing with the iliacus, sartorius, and gracilis getting involved. And then kind of similar to how in mid stance there were no muscles acting at the hip because of gravity, here you're kind of in a neutral position as well as you're advancing it, and this is shown by there not being like a moment at the initial swing phase. But once you move to the mid swing phase, it moves back to a hip flexion moment, and this is mirrored by once again having the extensors of the hip, once again being the glutes and hamstrings, controlling it eccentrically, and the pattern repeating. So this should honestly look pretty similar to what I just showed you with the ankle stuff. It's even kind of mirrored exactly in the muscular forces by starting with one eccentric, then the eccentrics of the other taking over, then that becoming a concentric contraction, and then shifting back to the eccentric of the original muscle to finish it out. All right, so started off with the ankle and hip. Make sure you get those down good. I wanted to start with those and make sure you have those down good first, because the knee kind of gets a little funky. So the quote-unquote rule that I use for the knee is that the direction of the torque is the same as the group of muscles active in that phase. So if at the knee there is an extension torque, then the knee extensor muscles will most likely be the ones that are active. And I put a little asterisk next to that because there's a section of the gait phase where this doesn't exactly apply, but we'll address that as we get there. All right. So starting off with initial contact, this part of the gait cycle does follow like the rule that I established for the knee joint. So when that foot hits the ground in initial contact, it's in an extension torque, just because I mean like your knee's basically in full extension, and this is controlled concentrically by the knee extensor muscles, basically just the quads. But then in loading response, like the knee starts to bend to bear the weight of the leg, so it enters a knee flexion moment. And this is where like the rule kind of shifts from the norm, because it's the opposite on this side. It's controlled by an eccentric contraction of the quads. And this kind of continues until the late part of the mid stance phase, which is when like the knee stops bending and starts to straighten all the way out, which is when it shifts from a flexion moment to an extension moment. And because of where the body's center of gravity is kind of moving forward, there's no muscular forces controlling this. It's just taken care of by momentum and gravity. The only real muscle action that's occurring here in a terminal stance is the hip abductors, primarily just the glute med, controls contralateral hip drop. So it prevents the other side's hip from kind of hanging down like below the ipsilateral side. But then when you have to pick the foot up for foot clearance, it shifts back into a flexion moment, which is controlled by the knee flexor muscles concentrically. So now that we're out of the loading response through terminal stance phases, we go back to the rule that I established in the previous slide. And once again, this is controlled by a concentric contraction of the knee flexors, namely just the iliacus and sartorius. But then moving into initial swing, in this phase, there aren't any torques or muscular forces happening. You're just kind of relying on gravity and momentum to take care of it. And as far as the muscular forces in mid-swing, it's the same thing, but in mid-swing, an extensor torque also begins. And in the terminal swing phase, it is controlled concentrically by the knee extensors. And if you look back at initial contact, it's the same thing there. So like I said a couple times before, like the knee gait cycle is kind of a deviation from the norm in a lot of places. But if you can just remember that the pre-swing through initial contact does follow the set rule, and the loading response through terminal stance is where it gets a little funky, and then try to memorize each component of that, I think you'll be fine.